This is your daily dose of all things royal. Welcome back, my gorgeous, good-looking friends. No matter how hard I try to find something good or nice to say about Meghan and Harry, they always seem to prove the opposite and show everyone just how corrupt and deceitful they are. So I'm looking at this ridiculous headline today. Prince Harry holding back Meghan Markle from confronting Charles over new venture. This seems to be the headline today that they have Tom Quinn pushing out to keep their names in the media. Now, when you look at this headline, you think, how ridiculous and stupid do these two look at this moment, thinking that Meghan Markle is someone to be able to confront the king. Like, she is nobody. And when you hear this arrogance with these titles, you think to yourself, well, why are they doing this? Is this to get an emotion or reaction to gaslight people? I think so. I think they're that much of a jerk that they would do that. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, they are doing things that they don't want the public to know. Just when you think you can't like this couple anymore, there is always something. Before I forget, if you could be so kind and help the kid out by hitting that like button, it always helps with the algorithm to make sure that more people are seeing it. This is going to be one of those videos where you're going to say, I heard it on TRG first. So for all you journalists out there that keep pushing this propaganda, just know that there are stories out there that are worth covering that people are going to be interested in, like this one. So here I go. Now, many of you have been following the saga of this ridiculous couple and recognize that they like to saturate the media with the most random shit, like this story, Harry popping up out of nowhere at a rodeo in Texas. This happened in March of 2022. There was no explanation as to why he was there. You know, many people thought that he was in Texas to film for Netflix and he was testing out some idea of visiting places in the United States. There was no explanation or follow-up explaining what this was all about. And then again, they saturated the media right after coming off the tail of this story. They went into announcing that Prince Harry is not going to be going to Prince Philip's memorial because of security, and that dominated the headlines. Then we had, right after it, coming off of it, Prince Harry in this ridiculous orange suit. That then dominated the headlines for a couple days pertaining to Invictus. From March 8th to March 12th, the headlines had been saturated with nothing but Prince Harry and all these stupid things that he was doing. And we, the public, talk about it and make the assessment that these two can't be taken seriously, especially when Harry is out there 1 minute in Texas looking like a deer in headlights at a rodeo, and then the next minute he is dressed up in an orange suit acting like a clown for Invictus. And we have seen this bizarre and random behavior quite a lot, with none of it ever making sense. And that's because this is all intentional. Harry and Meghan are truly up to no good. During this time, when the media was force-feeding us this garbage to make us think that this is what he was doing, but in reality, Harry was participating in a secret meeting with Senator Coons from Delaware. For those that don't know, Chris Coons is a Democrat from Delaware supporting the World Economic Forum and its agenda. He has, in the past, written an opinion piece on his website about working with Prince Harry and conservation for African parks. Here's something that none of us caught. So in December of 2022, Chris Coons writes on his website, in case you missed it, U.S. Senator Chris Coons, Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, and the president of African Parks, and the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, published an op-ed today in the Huffington Post that calls for conservation investments in Africa that are managed locally, prioritize human development, and bridge the public and private sectors. Sounds very WEFy, doesn't it? The three met earlier this year to discuss innovative forms of long-term financing for Africa's protected areas, which are critical to the health of our planet because of the biodiversity and carbon they hold. Later in the year, Senator Coons and Prince Harry traveled to Africa to meet with the communities partnering with African parks. Remember when Prince Harry popped in to Africa out of nowhere. And everybody was like, this was so random for him to just show up. And they didn't show any photos of him with Chris Coons. And it was rumored that he met with him, but there was no evidence of such, even though Chris Coons did go to Africa at that point. Hold that thought. At that time, back in August of 2022, this was the first that we heard that Harry had been engaged with Chris Coons from Delaware. I don't think anyone picked up the fact that there was another meeting that Harry had earlier in the year with Chris Coons that he and others did not want anyone to know about. You know how I'm always tripping over myself and falling down this rabbit hole. I stumbled across, in the public domain, Chris Coons' travel expenditures. From March 10th to March 12th, 2022, Chris Coons traveled to Rancho Mirage, California to attend a retreat held by the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands, Annenberg Foundation, and African Parks. So this is really interesting that Chris Coons went ahead and disclosed this information because he made the determination that the travel described was in connection with his duties as an office holder, aka senator, and that he was not using public office for private gain. So it says here, describing what this trip was about, was participating in a range of meetings focused on international conservation and the protection of protected areas in Africa. Meetings included discussions led by the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia and Prince Harry, the CEO of African Parks. Okay. And it goes into other speakers, but I want to point that out because this was led by him. Wait for it, folks. It's going to get worse. So what the heck is this 2-day retreat needing a private sponsored travel certificate form filled out? So just so people can understand that per law, the government officials have to fill out these forms if expenses are being taken care of by a private entity, which is what this is. This is declaring that this foundation trust is going to be paying for their expenses, such as lodging, airfare, on their dime. This is to make it appear that there's no bribery of some sort going on. This is why he is certifying that he is going to this retreat, because it does involve the duties as this congressman. Question stated here, the sponsors are not registered lobbyists or agents of a foreign principal and do not retain or employ registered lobbyists or agents of a foreign principal, and no lobbyists or agents of a foreign principal will accompany the member, officer, or employee at any point throughout the trip. He checks off, I certify that the trip will not be financed in any part by a registered lobbyist or agent of a foreign principal. And then finally, it says, I certify that the sponsor or sponsors will not accept funds or in-kind contributions earmarked directly or indirectly for the purpose of financing this specific trip from a registered lobbyist or agent of a foreign principal, or form a private entity that retains or employs one or more registered lobbyists or agents of a foreign principal. Finally, at the bottom here, it says, I certify that the trip will not in any part be planned, organized, requested, or arranged by a registered lobbyist or agent of a foreign principal, except for de minimis lobbyist involvement. And the traveler will not be accompanied on the trip by a registered lobbyist or agent of a foreign principal, except as provided for by committee regulations relating to lobbyist accompaniment. So now the forms get into disclosing what this trip is all about. And it says here, an itinerary for the trip is attached to this form. I certify that the attached itinerary is a detailed hour-by-hour, complete and final itinerary for the trip. So it asks, briefly describe the role of each sponsor in organizing and conducting the trip. It says here, Sunnylands is a 501c3 nonprofit established to address serious issues facing the nation and the world's community by hosting solution-driven meetings at the historic estate. Sunnylands team is working with African Parks to execute this 2.5-day meeting to have most tangible impact. So they are including, if I understand this correctly, African Parks also being a sponsor. Number 13 says, briefly describe the stated mission of each sponsor and how the purpose of the trip relates to that mission. Says here, Sunnylands is a 501c3 nonprofit established to address serious issues facing the nation and the world community by hosting solution driven meetings at the historic estate, repeating exactly what was said in number 12. The purpose of this trip is to explore how to amplify the role of African parks in addressing global climate crisis. So you see what's happening here. Climate change is the de facto response for any of these social impact causes and nonprofits. So we have here the purpose of this trip is to amplify the role of African parks addressing global climate crisis. Right? That really doesn't tell us very much, but that's what they're putting as the purpose. So part of this transparency, Chris Coons includes the correspondence with this organization, which began in December of 2021. As you can see, the email came from Ambassador David Lane, and we'll get to him in a second. But David writes, Dear Senator Coons, on behalf of the Annenberg Foundation, African Parks, and the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands, we are delighted to invite you to participate in a special retreat focused on conservation, specifically the future of Africa's protected areas in addressing the climate and biodiversity crises on March 10 through 12, 2022 at the Sunnylands Estate in Rancho Mirage, California. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, is a longtime president of African Parks. He is thrilled to co-host this special gathering and looks forward to welcoming you. The retreat will be a unique opportunity for a small group of top-level leaders from conservation, philanthropy, global development, and government to focus on the role of Africa's protected areas in addressing the global climate and biodiversity crises. So here we are again in this gray area with Prince Harry, a member of the British royal family who is on U.S. soil engaged with our U.S. congressman. Chris Coons, just so you know, as a senator, writes bills and legislations for our foreign policies. So funding, all that type of stuff, that is part of his responsibility. The goal is to create an actionable roadmap for conservation of Africa's large landscapes, one that includes funding mechanisms to ensure their long-term financial sustainability. In recognition of your expertise, we would be honored to include your perspective at this critical moment for conservation and climate action. On the surface, this sounds like a workshop where they're going to be brainstorming and putting ideas together. But what is troubling is what is said next. The retreat is designed as a confidential and rigorous experience that enables participants to engage in thoughtful and creative discussions and to build important and lasting relationships. The retreat is closed door, off the record, and will follow a modified Chatham House rule. That is a red flag right there. Off the record? What do you mean off the record? This is supposed to be a nonprofit. Transparency is important. Interestingly enough, does anybody know what this Chatham House rule is? Apparently, this is a thing. The rule reads as follows. When a meeting or part thereof is under the Chatham House rule, participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speakers nor that of any other participant may be revealed. So let me get this straight. You have Prince Harry, who is co-hosting a 2-day retreat off-site at Sunnylands in which they are telling participants that they need to follow this Chatham House rule, which is they cannot disclose the identity nor affiliation of the speakers or any of the other participants. Why? This retreat was a very big deal, and we'll get into the itinerary in a second. But what's the reason for not mentioning or being transparent about it? Why are they saying you gotta keep this off the record, especially to a senator? To me, that tells me something shady's going on. This Sunnylands appears to be like another one of these Bilderbergs where you have executives and leaders from governments coming together in this so-called private-public partnership to talk about how to shape the world for the rest of us. Just so you get a better idea of the kind of people that Meghan and Harry surround themselves with, this Ambassador David Lane started out from 1993 to 2000 working in the U.S. federal government during the Clinton administration. He was the chief of staff to the United States Secretary of Commerce. He then went on to get hired by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2001. Then he went on in early 2011, joining the Obama administration, and he served as the assistant to the President of the United States and counselor to the Chief of Staff in the White House, thus then becoming, in 2012, the U.S. ambassador to serve as the United States ambassador to the United Nations Agency for Food and Agriculture. So he's now all up in the UN. After his run with the Obama administration in September of 2016, he decided to go on to be president of the Annenberg Foundation Trust, in which he heads this nonprofit operating this Annenberg retreat called Sunnylands, what you're seeing here. So now you start to see how these Dems get away with so much. So here, this guy was in government this whole entire time, and all of a sudden now, after Obama leaves office and Trump comes in, he's all of a sudden going off and heading up a nonprofit to have these so-called off-the-record meetings. Apparently, there has been controversy in the past over these so-called secret meetings, which provoked this message being put up on their website, in which the letter that David writes says, "In this letter, which we intend to be an annual communication with our partners and friends, I hope to bring you inside the retreat program of the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands. To many, this program may seem mysterious or even invisible. I'd like to pull back the curtain and share a bit about what we do." And as he goes through this letter, he talks about some of the retreats that they held during 2022. And what's interesting is the one retreat that they chose to leave off there was this 2-day retreat that involved Prince Harry. As you can see, for 2022 on the website, it's nowhere listed. Contrary to what people may believe, it has nothing to do with Prince Harry's privacy and everything to do with what they were discussing in the retreat itself. The last thing I want to point out here from this letter that was sent to Chris Coons by David Lane and Wallace Annenberg is this point that they make here on the last page. Climate change and the loss of biodiversity are existential threats to the planet and to humanity. In response, scientists have called for 30% of the planet to be set aside for nature by 2030. I'm pointing this out to show you that these globalists are doing a mass land grab in what we're seeing with Africa. In the United States, I do believe Biden had passed some sort of executive order that 30% of our lands need to be protected. So at any point, I think as well in the UK, if the government says that they are taking the land for conservation, you don't have a choice. Even if it is your land, they will take it away from you. And that's the scary part about these people, because they want to take everything away from you. It is the reason why Harry does nothing or says nothing about the human rights abuses that are happening with African parks, because, in my opinion, it's intentional. It is to force people off the lands. But getting back to this retreat that's supposed to be off the record, let's take a look at the itinerary that was laid out for these 2 fun-filled days. Okay, taking a look. The goals that they set out to accomplish during these 2 days. 1, to bring together thought leaders in conservation, global development, and philanthropy to explore pathways for conservation of Africa's large landscapes. 2, to amplify the role of Africa's protected areas in addressing the global climate and biodiversity crises and the urgency of doing that now. 3, to identify opportunities and challenges to the funding mechanisms needed to scale effective protected area management in Africa and ensure the long-term financial sustainability of these efforts. And finally, produce a brief white paper capturing the key points of the discussions. As far as I'm aware, there was no white paper that was published for the public to read about the outcome of this joining of the magnificent minds. When we go through this, you'll soon realize that the primary objective for this is the money aspect of it. How are they going to fund this grift for years to come? So beginning on Thursday, March 10th, they lay out this itinerary where you see they have all these activities open for them at their leisure. Then at 12 o'clock, a nice little lunch on the terrace of the main house. Then a special welcome reception held. And then finally, the dinner honoring the work of African parks with the keynote address by the one and only Prince Harry. There's no way that Meghan would allow Harry to do this 2-day retreat by himself, surrounded by uber wealthy people and politicians. You can bet that she was sitting there. Moving on to day 2, Prince Harry back at it again at 9 a.m., giving the opening remarks. So, right after Harry's opening remarks, they get into the day 1 goals as well as setting out the objectives for the day and how it was going to go. At 9:45, the keynote address by the former president of Ethiopia, seen there to your right, and chairman of the African Union. Here's a little fun fact. Dr. Tedros was the Minister of Health of Ethiopia under this prime minister. We all know how badly the cholera outbreak was managed by this guy, and we also know how badly managed the coronavirus outbreak was, or lack of management. These are all the same people that force these jabs onto the world, but they themselves, there's no confirmation that they took them. And in this case, it doesn't look like Dr. Tedros either took it.
I want to ask you about your own vaccination. You got your first shot when?
Still I feel like I know where I belong. In a poor country called Ethiopia, in a poor continent called Africa, and wanted to wait until Africa and other countries in other regions, low-income countries, start vaccination. So I was protesting, in other words, because we're failing.
In any case, these are the folks that Harry is dealing with. I don't know how long ago this was, but I'm willing to bet that this guy wasn't jabbed. Neither was Meghan and Harry or any of the people that are forcing this way of thinking and living on us. Anyway, I continue on with this itinerary. The objectives of the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia's speech was to outline how to successfully protect, manage, and restore nature and biodiversity in the current African context, articulate the benefits of fully delegated management of protected areas to ensure long-term impact and conservation-led development of surrounding communities, and finally describe factors needed to convince African governments to engage in fully delegated management partnerships of their key protected areas. Now, what we've all come to understand is that African parks does not put the safety and the well-being of the indigenous people of the land first. Instead, they are putting the land and the resources as well as the animals ahead of the people who actually own the land. And what we're seeing happen here is not only conflict between the various militias and African park rangers who have been beating and raping the people of the land, but we're also seeing a population being forced out and this almost like colonialism happening again under the guise of conservation. And we've talked about this many times over. What's concerning is when you look at this African Parks 161 analysis, the one that they mentioned in the objectives here, you realize that this is a massive grab of land and resources away from its indigenous people, and why we're seeing the things that we're seeing with the Baka people, as well as the increase in poverty and hunger. It's because of these people. They are taking away the indigenous people's resources, the ability to fish, the ability to hunt, all in the name of conservation. Harry and his white folk friends need to stay the F out, but they can't because they see the money. And that's the sickest thing about all of this, is the fact that they're doing this in the name of conservation and saving the planet. It's really about population reduction and green colonialism, and a big way to steal taxpayer money. Because why else would they invite a U.S. senator to participate in this retreat, as well as now be a keynote speaker? As you can see, after lunch and networking on the terrace at 1:30, Chris Coons is giving the next keynote address, of which his focus is the importance of protecting nature and biodiversity for Africa's future. His objectives were describe the importance of Africa with respect to global biodiversity and climate crises, articulate the potential of conservation to support nature-positive development, and finally describe why the time is now to act and the potential of public-private partnerships. You see, this is the angering thing about all of this. When these government officials talk about this public and private partnership, this is only to serve them and their stock portfolio. The other thing I find extremely concerning is that there's no mention about protecting the human rights of the people anywhere. It's all about managing the landscapes. But it's this WAP complex that African Parks has. And when you look on their website, this is what they have to say about that. So, this WAP complex is a significant transboundary protected area that represents West Africa's largest intact wild ecosystem, of which the globalists and elites want to put a rope around, keeping people out. And what they're seeing in this region is escalated conflict and as well as increased population, which for them, they hate that. They want to get rid of the people because they want to hog the territory. But here, they're saying that there needs to be more money invested in here in order to, whether it be get more militia to go ahead and keep people out, to protect the animals, as well as the so called land. This is why nothing is being done to help the indigenous people. Closing out the Friday session, we have a breakout session with none other than Chris Coons. This time he's meeting on conservation finance. Now, why is a U.S. Senator going to a off-the-record retreat to talk about money? Whose money is he talking about? Obviously, he's going there representing the United States, so it's got to be surrounding American tax dollars. Now, moving into the final day on Saturday, this should infuriate everyone. So, the day before, we had Chris Coons and a few other sessions talking about the funding mechanisms. Okay, fair enough. On the final day of this retreat, they dedicated the rest of the session towards focusing on monetizing and profiting from a private perspective. So tell me, folks, what do you think this was more about? This was more about sitting down with Chris Coons and whether it be other influencers and talking about how do we draft a bill in order to siphon millions of dollars from the American people into now this and keep it coming like what they're doing with the Ukraine for the next 10 years. So after this off-the-record retreat, we, the public, found out about Harry going to Africa in August and Chris Coons being there. And then all of a sudden, Chris Coons writing on his website about the bill that he submitted in November of 2022. So when I went to this bill, it turns out they want to build a new foundation called the United States Foundation for International Conservation, in which money would be granted to this foundation. And from there, the foundation then gives out grants. Now, you can pause this if you'd like to read about how this theoretical grant making would happen under this new act called the United States Foundation for International Conservation Act of 2022 to understand how the money would flow. So, what this act is going to do for the next 10 years, guarantee a certain amount of money is up for grabs for these organizations like an African Parks, and then maybe African Parks would give some to Archewell. However, Harry and Meghan have their setup. Money is going to be flowing. This is how it comes from the taxpayer down to these corrupt globalist parasites to where barely any of this money will get down to reaching the people who actually need it. Now, if this bill should pass, what it's asking for is a guarantee of $100 million every year for the next 10 years of taxpayer money to go towards a program like this where African Parks or maybe even Archewell could get their hands on American taxpayer money. And it's not just NGOs that would be eligible to get this money. It would be other companies, private companies that could be focused on saving the planet and this initiative towards 2030 in conservation. So it could be very well a publicly traded company in which maybe Senator Coons might want to invest in. You see how these senators and congressmen get wealthy like Nancy Pelosi? This is what goes on. And of course, if you go through this bill, there's no mention of human rights abuses that are happening in these areas of where they want to push this green colonialism. So now this gives a very good explanation as to why we see these stupid articles from time to time with these random photos that pop up here and there to get the media talking. While we should know better and say that, yeah, Harry and Meghan are up to no good, and they're probably doing stuff that they don't want the public to know, like this stuff with conservation, as well as the stuff with censorship. And most likely, the reason why we haven't seen or heard from Harry and Meghan is not because they're embarrassed, is because they're doing something. With all this media that Meghan and Harry put out, it makes you think that they do nothing all day long. But I think this is by design. Otherwise, we would have probably have raised noise if we found out that Harry was entertaining a US senator at a retreat for a couple days. That doesn't look good from the optics perspective, as him being a British prince on US soil. He should not be engaging with our senators to talk about funding and policy and driving this kind of stuff. Clearly, as a result of this retreat, months later, we have a bill where they're trying to lock down $100 million for the next 10 years. Doesn't take a genius to realize that this bill was inspired from this retreat that was supposed to be off the record. Now we understand why Harry didn't mention it and they wanted it to be off the record. It's because you can't say that you were whining and dining a senator, even though he filled out all these transparency paperwork. It's clear when you look at the itinerary that they laid out, funding and money was a core focus of this agenda. And we could probably assume that Harry and Meghan going to Nigeria probably had something to do with this conservation climate change scam as well. But what do you guys think? Does this surprise you? I mean, it surprised me to see that he went away and co-hosted this retreat without saying nothing, which shows me that they were definitely trying to hide it. But let me know your thoughts. As always, I will be back with more content, but until then, please be safe and I'll talk to you later. Bye!
Such a fraud.